Thank you very much. I said one word in Portuguese, obrigado, and now the rest in English. If I say anything too crazy or you don't understand, put up your hand and I'll go back over it. The topic, some of the things that Students for Liberty is involved in, is promoting the ideas of liberty all around the world. And it's very exciting to see estudantes pela liberdade here in Brazil, African Students for Liberty, European Students for Liberty, Students for Liberty, and even very difficult, exotic, strange places like Canada, Massachusetts, and so on. So this project that I've been involved in has been promoting a number of books. This is one of the first ones in the series, and then this one, After the Welfare State, the most recent one, was made up almost entirely of articles by students, by young people, of why liberty. And the next one, which I've been working on a great deal, that's going to come out in September, is on peace, love, and liberty. What we want to do is to take back the high moral ground, the ground that was taken away by collectivism and socialism. And liberalism is the philosophy of equal freedom. It is the philosophy of liberating the poor. It was known to be such in the 18th and 19th centuries. That liberalism was the group that cared about the poor. It is the philosophy of equality, and very importantly, the philosophy of peace. And this next book, I think, demonstrates it very, very well. So let's just think a little bit about war. It's sometimes difficult when you see photos to distinguish the effects of war from natural disasters. But there's a big difference. Wars don't just happen. They're not like tornadoes or lightning. War is organized human violence. That's what war is all about. It's the organization of the power to kill other people and destroy things. Now, it does a lot more than the things we normally think of: destroying lives, hopes, families, all of the death associated with war. This is a photo I took in Kabul. This is what happens after 35 years of war, utter destruction of a society. But it kills something else as well, and that's liberty. That's one of the victims of war that very few people notice. We notice the dead bodies, we notice destroyed buildings, but liberty also is destroyed by war. Randolph Bourne was a very interesting American writer. In the middle of the First World War, put it very neatly: war is the health of the state. It grows the state like nothing else can. It's an opportunity to steal from people, to plunder them. Thomas Paine, I think one of his more memorable statements, in reviewing the history of the English government, its wars and taxes, an observer not blinded by prejudice nor warped by interest would declare that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but that wars were raised to carry on taxes. I think that's a deeper understanding of the relationship. What we see typically is an increase in state powers during war, and after a war, sometimes they fall back, but never to the level they had before the war. War is a great mechanism for increasing the power of the state and stealing the liberties of the people. You may have heard of this organization recently. It's definitely heard of you. I occasionally go to the NSA website whenever I want to hear the personal conversations of presidents of other countries, for example, spying on everyone around the world illegally, openly against the law, violating the requirements of the U.S. Constitution and the orders of federal judges, and the written laws of the Congress, but all, we are told, to protect us from foreign enemies. And then, of course, the violation of standards of morality and decency, as well as law, the USA Patriot Act of the United States. If you don't know, USA Patriot stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorists. So some government bureaucrat spent days working that out. It's called Patriot, which meant if you opposed it, you are not a patriot. You are a traitor if you're against this kind of legislation. And I highlighted this: enhanced surveillance procedures. We've also heard of enhanced interrogation procedures, in which government agents engaged in grotesque, illegal torture of people to get information from them. This is authentically shameful, but made possible because everyone was told we're in a war. And in the war, you abandon legal and moral standards. And of course, one of the final, the selective service system. You see how happy all these young men are? Well, what's about to happen to them? They're being registered as the property of the state. Their lives are not their own to dispose of, but that they are the property of the state. This is a topic I worked very hard on for a long time, to get rid of military conscription and to stop civilian conscription, which was what the left was proposing. We had very little support from the American left because they said, well, we'll keep the military. We're happy if you add slavery in hospitals and national parks as well. But we were able to defeat it. Unfortunately, we could not defeat this. Now, war has long been known to be an enemy of liberty. James Madison, the principal author of the American Constitution, put it nicely: of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. It comprises and develops the germ of every other. So every enemy of liberty is contained in war: censorship, violation of personal freedom, increase of the power of the state, and so on. It's interesting to transport ourselves into a different time when war was openly celebrated and taken for granted. The famous passage from Heraclitus: war is the father of all and the king of all. Some he shows as gods, others as men, and some he makes slaves and others free. Now, slavery and freedom and the relationship between gods and men were the constant features of his social order. What he was saying here is war is the creator of everything. A very different perspective from the one most people today have. I'll talk about why the world has changed in this regard. But even in the modern era, war was celebrated. Joseph de Maistre, he said, it is the habitual state of mankind. Human blood must flow without interruption, somewhere or other on the globe. For every nation, peace is only a respite. So this is an open celebration of war. He thought war was a constant, and as he said, human blood must flow without interruption. It was only in the modern era that the idea of a movement for peace emerged. There were, of course, individuals who were against war in the past. Think about very great religious figures. Some obvious ones come to mind in this context. But as a movement, an organized movement that stood up for peace, that had to wait until the modern era. It was called liberalism. Classical liberalism or libertarianism. It's a philosophy of peace and cooperation, and establishes the institutions that create peaceful relations. I'm going to say something a bit strong. There is no other ideology that puts peace at the Indeed, we think about Frédéric Bastiat, one of my heroes, a great champion for peace, an advocate of disarmament and demilitarization in Europe. In his speech to the youth of France, he said of the socialists, although they have a kind of sentimental love of humanity in their hearts, hate flows from their lips. Each of them reserves all his love for the society he has dreamed up. But the natural society in which it is our lot to live cannot be destroyed soon enough to suit them. So that from its ruin arise the new Jerusalem, the new utopia that they were going to create. In particular, he noted that other views, nationalism and socialism, rested on the idea that antagonism, opposition, was central to all social life. So as he pointed out, some of these antagonisms between the socialists found everywhere, between property owner and worker, between capital and labor, common people and bourgeoisie, agriculture and industry, farmer and city dweller, native-born and foreigner. This one is a very common complaint in Europe right now, complaints about foreigners. Producer and consumer, civilization, social order, and as he pointed out, between liberty and social harmony. Now, in the late 19th century, liberalism, which stood for a philosophy of live and let live, a philosophy of cooperation, a philosophy of peaceful coexistence between nations and religions and groups, they believed conflict could be reduced and human beings could live in harmony. But that philosophy went into decline. Late 19th century, it was replaced by other ideologies. This man, E.L. Godkin, very famous Irish-American writer, in 1900 said nationalism, with a sense of national greed, has supplanted or replaced liberalism. An old foe under a new name. And this is some of the most chilling words I've ever read in my life, in the year 1900. The old fallacy of divine right has once more asserted its ruinous power, and before it is again repudiated, there must be international struggles on a terrific scale. He understood what the next century was going to bring. Incredible, staggering, organized human violence, as the philosophy of nationalism, imperialism, socialism, all forms of collectivism were replacing liberalism. The consequence, certainly in Europe, was World War I, a collective act of mass suicide of Western civilization, and then the rise of Bolshevism, fascism, National Socialism that emerged out of this horror. Now, there were some liberal intellectuals who opposed this, notably a number of artists. This man, I consider him really a great human being. His name is Erlich Maria Remarque, and his book, All Quiet on the Western Front, which was a terrifying vision of what war meant, the horror, the drudgery, the sickening violence of war. And he became a best-selling author, warning the world about it, and he was a voice for liberalism through his artistic works against statism, against collectivism, and against war. Another who also wrote in German, Robert Musil, unfortunately not so well known, but a great classical liberal artist as well. His book, The Man Without Qualities, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, raised a different perspective, opposition to the collectivism that was becoming more and more powerful in Europe. These two men had all of their books burned by the National Socialists. They were thrown into the flames as anti-German writers. Although both of them wrote in German and were Germans, they were expelled from their homeland. One died in Switzerland and the other in the United States. But let's not think all artists are in favor of peace. That is unfortunately not true. A very important writer was a man named Ernst Jünger. He was a stormtrooper in the war. He wrote one of the most influential novels of the last century, called The Sturm of Steel, in Stahlgewitter in German. And it's the account of his experience as a soldier. And he presents it as the most sublime possible experience of a human being. To be a soldier, to confront another, to risk your life, and to kill another human being. He says, I learned from this 4-year schooling in force, and all the fantastic extravagance of material warfare, there are ideals in comparison with which the life of an individual, and even of a people, has no weight. As he said, although he stood in Haute here in mud and blood, he's always fixed on this higher ideal. What was the higher ideal? The state. The state and the nation. And as he says, it is not every generation that is so favored. Can you imagine that? Those who survived the First World War, this mass slaughter, he said they were the most favored generation. You, in contrast, not having experienced a colossal war, he felt sorry for you. You have not had that great benefit and advantage. Now, he lived a long time, over 100 years, and was celebrated by all the leftists of Europe. François Mitterrand gave him an award. He became a great hero of the left, and the reason was he hated liberalism. One thing he hated was personal freedom. And as he put about his book, Der Arbeiter, The Worker, which is a hugely influential book from 1932, he was interviewed about this book in his 90s. He says, I was very interested in the plan. He was talking about the Soviet Union. The idea of the plan. I told myself, granted, they have no constitution, but they do have a plan. And this may be an excellent thing. What he wanted was always the subordination of the individual to the collective. Soviet Union or Third Reich, he served them both eagerly. The one thing he hated was peace and personal liberty. Now you might think, what philosopher would really be in favor of war? Really. It's almost unthinkable. We think of philosophers, academics, they're all peace advocates, right? Well, you'd be wrong. I want to introduce you to one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, and today, an extremely influential figure. His name is Carl Schmitt. He was a writer in Germany on law, a very interesting lawyer. He's not very often cited these days. You won't find him in the headline, but you will always find him in the footnotes of every anti-globalization screed, every attack on free trade, every attack on liberalism. You will find this man in the footnotes. This may be the reason why you won't find him in the headlines. Here he is with his friend Captain Ernst Jünger of military intelligence for the Third Reich in Paris. Schmitt was a very active member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi party as it was known. So our leftist friends find it ever so slightly embarrassing that they're just echoing Carl Schmitt, because they're not happy being associated with the Third Reich. But the fact of the matter is that his hatred of liberalism is what has informed the far right, fascistic movements, and far left. A very important book he wrote, The Concept of the Political, argues that the distinction between friend and enemy is central to understanding political life. The specific political distinction can be reduced to that between friend and enemy. And then, enemy is not just someone you hate. It's not the neighbor whose dog barks too loud at night. Not that. He said, An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. So, we are all together. We are friends because we are their enemies. That was, in his view, the defining feature of political life. And he hated liberalism because it attempted to undermine that. Because the free trade advocates said, if we have free trade and free travel, people can become friends. And they thought it was possible that there could be a world without enemies. It's this ideal you could strive to, and you could actually approximate it. Schmitt said, no. You would destroy the life of the human being, you would drain it, you would eliminate seriousness. True serious life requires enemies. And political life is only created because it's us against them. Brazilians against Argentines, Germans against French, Americans against Canadians. Everyone knows. I should point out, by the way, if you looked at a map of North America, if you take the U.S.-Canadian border, 4,000 miles undefended, the U.S. is defenseless against the Canadian menace. And moreover, over 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Accident? I don't think so. They are waiting to pull that undefended border and take the Americans by surprise. That's my theory. But this is not just a part of the fantasies of the far right. It now permeates political thought. And in particular, someone you may recognize if you are required to read political thought, this man, one of the most famous clowns of the society, Slavoj Žižek, is a clear Schmittian. As he said, and I apologize for his terrible writing style, but he is Slavoj Žižek, is not the relationship to an external other as a way of disavowing the internal struggle which traverses the social body. In other words, when the nationalist says, the evil Canadians, he says, they're only covering up the real antagonism. It traverses the social body. It's all through society. It's internal. In contrast to a leftist position should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism as constitutive of the political. The conflict between old and young, black and white, men, women, on and on and on. All of those antagonisms constitute political life for someone such as Žižek, and he celebrates it. This is the whole point of life, is to engage in endless struggle against enemies. Now, the need for enemies promotes war. And indeed, I should point out, he was wrong about Schmitt, deliberately so, in my opinion. Schmitt also believed in internal enemies. What were they called in Germany? The Jews. He said, people who seem to be of us but are not. And he went on, they learned our language because they were Germans. But they weren't really. But there was an internal enemy for Schmitt also. For Žižek, there's also internal enemies. Those are primary. In recent years, though, we've seen the need for external enemies. The American neoconservatives, William Kristol, Robert Kagan, said that we should embrace the possibility of national greatness. How boring to have a society dedicated to the pursuit of happiness. It's un-American. Well, you see, of course, the irony. The American Declaration of Independence doesn't talk about national greatness. It talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But now that's not good enough for these men. We want to restore a sense of the heroic. And how do we do that? Invading other countries. You invade Iran, you invade other countries, kick them around, and then you feel your national greatness. Now, the philosophy of inherent antagonism is very much alive today. This man, I really admire, Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, describes the counter-enlightenment, which includes Marx and Mussolini and de Maistre and many others. They rejected the assumption that violence was a problem to be solved. Struggle and bloodshed are inherent in the natural order and cannot be eliminated without draining life of its vitality and subverting the destiny of mankind. Now that's obviously not Pinker's view. He's describing the view of the enemies of liberalism, those who hate the liberal life, whether it's Ernst Jünger, or Benito Mussolini, or Slavoj Žižek. Now, wars are the result, though, of human choice. They don't just happen. And I have a simple proposition. If you can make the choice for war, then you can make the choice for peace also. Peace also is a matter of conscious choice. And that choice is the most important choice anyone can face. And I should mention, I'll get to this, why I think Brazil actually has a kind of special role in this in the world. Although Brazil is not currently at war with many of its neighbors, we'll be grateful for that. Brazil does have an important role as a diplomatic go-between in the world. Now, some of the conditions for peace: limited and accountable government, freedom of speech, people can criticize their government, open and accountable state behavior, active public discussion, an active citizenry who challenge their leaders and may even engage in civil disobedience. Very important. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. Cross-border trade and investment. The old saying, when good cannot cross borders, armies well. There's a very good chapter in the book that I commissioned by Professor Eric Gartsky from University of California, San Diego, on the free trade peace. That's quite significant. And then the presumption against war. And I have some chapters in the book on this question. You cannot be neutral on the question of war and peace. If you're not for it, you have to be against it. And there might be wars you should be for. If your country is being invaded, if you're in Poland in 1939, and you're invaded by your two big neighbors, well, I think you should fight. But if you're not for it, you can't say, I don't know. You have to be against it. And that's the topic that I discuss in the book. Now, a few other questions though. Some people argue, well, war is beneficial to a nation. It pays. Well, it does for some people. The cronies, the ones who provide the war material, it pays for them. It doesn't pay for society as a whole, for the ones who pay all the taxes and do all of the bleeding. And the liberals understood the answer is no. There was a time when war was an important way of acquiring wealth. Vikings would go out with empty ships and come back full of silver and beautiful girls. Those were stolen. They stole the lives of people, and they stole their money. So in some sense it paid for them. But it's been a long time since that kind of argument could be made for social order. Adam Smith understood that very well. His argument against the British Empire is very direct and very clear. This is a long quote. I'll just point out this. He says that the British Empire in recent years had acquired so much debt just to protect their colonies and to monopolize the trade. The interest on the debt was greater than the value of all the goods traded. It's staggering. Merely to protect a small number of people who got their monopolies, they impoverished the entire society. Just the payment on the interest of the debt required to maintain the Navy was greater than the value per year of all of the trade involved. The English liberals such as John Bright, who were enemies of imperialism, also understood this. And he said that the British Empire is neither more nor less than a gigantic system of outdoor relief, that means welfare payments, for the aristocracy of Great Britain. If you were the third son of the Earl of something or other, or the Duke of this or that, you could not inherit the title. So what did they do with you? You became a viceroy of Burma. They sent you out to the British Empire. You had to have a fabulous house. It was really wonderful. You got an income from the taxpayer. What he said was, this is a system of welfare payments for the wealthy aristocracy of Britain. Indeed, the most extensive study ever produced of the British Empire, Ammon and the Pursuit of Empire, concluded decisively the British as a whole did not benefit economically from the empire. Now, most of our leftist friends agree with the imperialists. They think, as Lenin did and others, that empire was good for the imperialist nation. But if you look at the numbers, look at the expenditures for the armies and the fleets, this is not the case. There's a huge loss of wealth because of the empire. But finally, we're told, well, we need to have war for oil. American politicians say this. Secretary of State James Baker put it, he said that a dictator, Saddam Hussein, acting alone and unchallenged, could strangle the global economic order by cutting off the access to the oil. That is not true. And this is again a topic of serious empirical investigation. David Anderson of the Council of Economic Advisors looked at this. He said the only way this argument can be made is if you assume military activity has no cost. But that's not true. All those battleships, all those aircraft carriers, they're very expensive. Under the worst assumption of a total loss of access to Middle Eastern oil, complete blockade, what would be the damage to foreign economies, U.S., Japan, Western Europe, and so on? It was much less than the cost of the military expenditure. Why? Because human beings evolved an incredible device for dealing with this. It's called the price system and the market economy. Prices go up and people can adjust their behavior as a consequence. But the imperialists and the socialists do not understand that. And they also assume military force is causeless. In the debate about the second Iraq War, William Niskanen, who recently passed away, was chairman of the Cato Institute, and he debated the former director of the CIA. He said, well, we need this to get access to oil. And he said very neatly, the oil is not worth the war. There's a world market for oil. War is not the way you get access to resources. And again, I have a lot of discussion with empirical evidence and arguments about why these arguments don't work. So we don't need, the vast majority of people do not benefit from wars for glory or prestige, or I recently debated a fellow, we need military service to make you into a real man. This from someone who had not served in the military. So I point out, I don't debate people who aren't real men. We need wars for energy, and so wars to end all wars. What do we need? Well, peace, freedom of trade, limited government, and freedom to challenge governmental policies. In short, liberty. Now, our arguments have already had a positive impact on the world, much more so than most people know. Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, is really a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. I hope a Portuguese edition is underway. It's a great work of social science. It is published. It's a fabulous book. And he points out something that is shocking. violence has been declining for a long time in human history, not just the last 60 years, thousands of years, a general decline. And he said that not just war, that's the obvious one, but all kinds of human violence. It used to be common for husbands to beat up their wives. This is much less common and is generally recognized as a criminal assault. Not very long ago, it was considered not my problem if someone did that. We're seeing this now becoming a big debate in India, violence against women, which has been going on for thousands of years, and people are now saying it has to stop. Violence against children also. It used to be common for children to be savagely whipped and beaten. They always said, wait till your father gets home, and so on. The terror. All around the world, this is much less common. Human beings are becoming more peaceful. And as he points out, one of the important reasons is classical liberalism has permeated the world to such a large degree. Trade, limited government, and so on. So just a little bit of data. A staggering decline in wars resulting in territorial change, with a tiny uptick in the last few months, called Crimea, but the general trend is downward. We can look at militarized disputes between pairs of democracies, falling quite dramatically. We can look at global conflict. Most of the conflicts occur in places that are isolated from trade. Not an accident that you don't see a lot of them here, or around here. These tend to be places where there isn't much trade. International trade relative to GDP has been increasing quite dramatically from this low period, increasing enormously. So what explains it? And I asked Eric Gartsky to produce an original chapter for the book. He points out that this general decline in militarized disputes among states corresponds with the increase in international trade. This is what's called the polity support, that is to say, the degree to which countries correspond to democratic liberal principles. The reason for this decline, by the way, it's a little bit confusing, is at this time the number of countries in the world goes up because empires are broken up in Africa and Asia, and most of those countries were not very democratic. And yet it recovered and has been climbing in recent years. Let's see again, world exports, and again, trade against GDP. Now, why do I focus on trade as an important element? Free trade, very significant, not only because it raises living standards, not only because it helps the poor. Those two are true. And serious people would have great difficulty breaking arguments against them. But free trade has another great advantage. It civilizes us. There's a story that you're acquainted with from Homer. He has an American television show that's very popular today, Homer Simpson. But he also wrote a poem a few thousand years ago called the Odyssey. And in it, there's a quite memorable passage. Odysseus and his men and their ship, they land on an island. And they meet the Cyclops. He's not a very nice man. He's not very hospitable. He proceeds to attack and eat the sailors, tears them apart and consumes their flesh. And Odysseus asks him a question. He says, what is my guest gift? Because it was traditional when you land on someone's island that you receive a gift of water, wine, food, and some shelter. And then you could go on your way. And you can see why that would happen, because you might end up on his island. So this reciprocity was a common feature. And Zeus was called the god of strangers, because if you cheated the stranger or did not treat him well, Zeus would watch and punish you. So he says, what gift do you give to me? And the Cyclops says, I will eat you last, which on the scale of gifts is quite low. And then Homer asks the question, why is the Cyclops a savage? Why did he behave like this? And his answers are quite interesting. The Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows. This is the front part of the ship. No shipwrights, builders of ships, to build a strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. The Cyclops is a brutal savage because he doesn't trade. He lives in the ideal world of the anti-globalization movement. All the production and all the consumption is local. He doesn't trade with other countries or other islands. And the consequence is he's a savage. So the question is, in the politics of the world today, as we see more people embrace economic nationalism, as we've seen political ideologies become more well-defined and articulate in opposition to liberalism, who is it that actually stands for peace? And I know the answer to that. It's you. You represent the peace movement today. The people who really understand peace is not merely a sentiment. It is a goal. It is a desirable goal. And there are institutions that will make peace more likely, that will diminish the likelihood of war. So war is a choice. If you're not for it, you have to be against it. And you have to be against those institutions that promote war. The book will come out in English in early September, end of August. It'll be available online, so you can download it as well. It represented an enormous work of love on my part and my co-authors, and many nights working until 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, checking footnotes and translations from German and French and so on. Let me conclude, though, with the words of a great champion of peace. And that was Frederick Bastiat. He was asked once, when he was at the French National Assembly, he had been critical of the budget, and they said, Monsieur Bastiat, what is your plan? What is your plan? And I love his answer. It's very direct and clear. Liberty within, peace without. This is the entire plan. That's it. And I think that that's an inspiring plan. Thank you very much. I should mention I'm currently suffering a terrible Brazilian cold. It's one of Brazil's worst exports. I'm in favor of protection against viruses. So I won't shake anyone's hands, okay? Because I'm selfish and I don't want to share my cold. Actually, that's quite right. We believe in the philosophy of peace because fundamentally we don't believe in hitting other people to make them change their behavior. So we have peace at the real core of the liberal philosophy. Other people believe, whether they're socialists or nationalists or so-called conservatives or American-style liberals, what have you, that if your behavior is inappropriate or displeases me, that correct response is I should hit you. I should come and take your things and strike you and beat you, or put you in a little cage, like you would for a violent dog. We call that a prison. And it is so permeated the mentality that, and particularly in the United States, which I'm ashamed to say, leads the world in imprisonment of people, has more prisoners than any other country in the world, and a higher percentage of the population than even authoritarian states such as China or Russia. It's the US. And the reason is the mentality has become, people do something I don't like, so I have to go hit them and hurt them and drag them away and put them into a room and lock the key, take away their freedom. That's violence. It's a kind of war on a small scale. So I think the philosophy of peace and the philosophy of liberty really are one and the same at some deep level. The second point is that people don't understand often that trade is the alternative to war. And that's very significant. In doing research for this book, I read a lot of terrible, terrible literature by people who really believe in liberalism. I want to understand it. But sometimes I felt like I should go take a shower after I read it, because the views they upheld were so horrifying, of hatred, glorification of hatred. Here's one I found that was really surprising. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx attacked free trade. They said, yes, it's reduced war, but only to make even more vicious and brutal exploitation possible. So they admitted war went down because of free trade. But they thought people buying and selling coconuts or grapefruit was a more brutal form of exploitation. And I was really struck by that. It then came out when I gave a talk on Pinker's thesis at St. Petersburg University and State University in Russia. And one of the students was a smart fellow. He asked a question. He said, you say violence is going down, and I had a lot of other data on that. That's not true. I said, okay, what do you mean? He said, economic violence is increasing. I said, what's economic violence? He said, free trade. I said, oh, interesting. What do you define as violence? They said, it's all violence. I said, I'll tell you what I define as violence. When someone plunges a piece of metal into my body and it punctures me and all of my blood pours out, I call that violence. And there's less of that now. Instead, people exchange toasters and computers and grapefruit. He said, it's all the same. I said, okay. He thought that buying and selling was no less violent than killing people. At some point I said, we just live on a different planet. Really, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. You think that my going into the store and giving someone 20 rubles for a sandwich is morally the same as chopping his head off? So why don't you just think about that a little bit? But that's the problem with those views, is they see exchange as another form of violence. And Marx and Engels articulated that very clearly. There's some mental shift that I think they need to be confronted with two pictures. You know, man buying sandwich from another man, and then man chopping other man's head off. You say, do you see any difference between these two? And if you don't, I don't know what else to say. But obviously everyone does when you confront it that way. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know what are your perspectives about peace in America for the next years, because George Bush's terms, both terms, were terms of war. And Obama was elected with a message of peace, but I don't see him doing anything on that way to the way of peace. So what are your perspectives?
Well, you are so cynical. I can't believe that Mr. Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? He was nominated before he became president, and he accepted the prize as he had just sent 40,000 soldiers to Afghanistan. But he got the Nobel Peace Prize. So he got the award. I think you're right about this. I do see some hope, though. The hope is more people are sick of war. They've had enough. And the taste for that is gone. The cost has come home. This is one reason why wars can be promoted. You can be fooled about what it's going to cost you. But at some point the bill comes due. And the $4 trillion bill is now being paid. And it turns out $4 trillion is a lot of money. It's so much money, I don't even have any idea how much it is. It's unimaginable. That's about what those two wars cost, plus the thousands of lives and on and on. People, I think, are pretty sick of that. So the appetite for it is declining very, very dramatically. And people also are beginning to understand that their leaders lie to them. I know this is shocking to you, but politicians lie all the time. And there's a trick, by the way. You know how to tell when politicians are lying? Their lips move. Right? And that's the sign they're lying to you. And more people are now aware of this. Unfortunately, there are kind of cycles of these things. And William Crystal, my quoted, said we have to get over the Vietnam syndrome. Oh my God, people were tired. They only cost 55,000 American lives, about 1 million Vietnamese lives, and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of money. Come on, get over it. Get over it. Let's go to war again. And we did. And now people are tired of it. I hope that they'll be tired for a very long time. The good news is that even those wars have been less destructive of human life than previous wars. It seems like a very small consolation, but it is something. Wars of that magnitude killed a lot more people in the past. People are more alert, more upset by this. When we watch it on television, we see it on YouTube and so on. I think generally the appetite for war is declining around the world, including in the United States. So I'm generally optimistic about these matters. I will mention one thing that worries me. And there is a new philosophy of war that is emerging. It's a recrudescence, a reemergence of real fascism, and it's in Europe right now. The last European elections, I thought, were really frightening. For the first time in the European Parliament are real Nazis. When I say real Nazis, I mean like the real thing. Swastikas, there's no camera on me, but they do this at their party meetings, right? They're scary. They condemn Jews, blacks, on and on and on. In Hungary, the Jobbik party got over 20% of the vote. The majority party is quite fascist also, in my opinion. In Greece, Front National is less fascistic, but they're kind of moderate fascists, if you want to think of it that way. Still bad. But also in Russia, there is now an upsurge of a philosophy of violence in Russia. I find this very disturbing. And our Russian colleagues, the Russian Students for Liberty, were all arrested when they protested the invasion of Ukraine and Crimea. They were arrested just for standing on a street corner with a piece of paper that said love in Russian. Nothing else. Just stand there with a sense of love. Arrested and taken off. And if you want to read an authentic fascist National Socialist thinker today, read a man named Alexander Dugin, who's professor at Moscow State University and the leading theoretician of the Eurasianist movement.
This is really an expansionist fascist movement, and it unfortunately is quite influential in the Kremlin. And they are busy causing trouble in neighboring countries. So in Europe, I think that there's a possibility of ongoing conflict and violence. Will it erupt in another World War II type scenario? I don't think so. The costs are too great, but I do think we should anticipate some years of additional violence in Eurasia because of this what's called the Eurasianist movement, which is very openly National Socialist, very hateful. The first they targeted are homosexuals for persecution, for murder, for reduction of legal status. That's an easy group to persecute because very few people will defend them. But other groups are on the list to be the scapegoats and the targets of this basically neo-Nazi movement. So I'm a little pessimistic in that part of the world at the moment. But I think with the growth of modern social media, it will be very difficult to organize violence on the scale that we saw in the past. But I do anticipate very bad things happening over the next decade in that part of the world. So I'm generally optimistic, but I think we should get ready for some bad things to happen in the next years also. Yes, sir.
What is I think you said earlier in the lecture that military service should not be meant to advance. How to work with the contribution? I mean, I as a country decided not to put military service as mandatory, but my neighbor, everybody in the list, and so how to work with that? I mean, I'm in favor of volunteering, to be honest, to defend, but how to work that line.
That's a very good point. Just to rephrase, because your voice is a little soft. What if one country introduces compulsory military service and the next country doesn't? Are they at a disadvantage? And perhaps they would be a victim. Is that your question?
To put that in
Yes. Well, one thing we found consistently is when countries are invaded, people usually are willing to defend them. And indeed, I showed you a slide of the American conscription system. It's called selective service administration. Selective. There's a reason for that. During periods when the U.S. went to war, with World War I and World War II, there were mass volunteerism. Huge numbers of people volunteered, especially after World War II when the U.S. was attacked, but also World War I, after the sinking of the Lusitania ship by a German submarine. There were so many, they said, we don't want them all. We want selective service. So you happen to be a great scientist or a graduate student, we're not going to select you. You're an investment in the future of the nation. But the guy back there with the red tie, come on, he's expendable. He's going to go. So basically, that's why you got these military systems where if you stay in college forever, you don't get drafted. That's how that originated. Because the country needs more anthropologists. It's unlikely, but they just set a standard of all college students are exempted. They're the intellectual cream. One consequence in the U.S. was everyone went to college forever. And it created what we call the New Left. People with multiple PhDs in utterly useless topics. Cultural this and social that, and interactive women's studies programs with a specialty, and on and on and on and on. So we ended up with huge overinvestment in useless human capital and an entrenched academic left. That's basically one of the consequences of military conscription. And other people who were not so articulate got drafted. The ones who didn't go to college, the ones who didn't have parents who were educated, they all went into the army. That was the goal. So you don't lack volunteers. And military conscription is not, in all other things being illegal, a military advantage. That's one thing that's very important. Most conscript armies don't fight very well when they're up against volunteer forces. This is well established empirically. When we abolished military conscription in the U.S., people said, oh, we'll be defenseless. Not true. They found if you pay soldiers properly, you don't have to enslave them. Now, it costs more on the budgetary front to pay enough money to live, but it costs much less to society because the stolen years of your life as a soldier are valuable, and those are not being valued under military conscription. They're valued at zero, but they are valuable. They also found that policies with regard to soldiers changed dramatically. If a general can conscript and say, send me more soldiers, he treats them as having no value. So he throws them away, they die in argument. But when you have to pay to train and retain them, the generals began to treat soldiers very, very differently. And so in every dimension, I much prefer volunteer only. In every dimension, I think it's preferable to a conscript army. And even in Russia, they've discovered this. They have compulsory service in Russia, and it's terrible. You do not, anyone here want to join the Russian army? No, good. It's awful. The brutality against soldiers is terrible because they're conscripts. And even Mr. Putin has understood this and has begun to diminish this and is paying soldiers much more money for the professional military service. Conscript armies are by and large not very effective, especially for defending the country. So this doesn't work. Yeah, you pay people. So there are two ways, if I want you to do something for me, there are two ways you can do it. I can take a gun, point it at you and say, do this or I'll shoot you. That's number one. Number two is I can say, what would you like in exchange for doing something for you? A car, a house, money. Money will buy a car and a house. I'll give you money. Those are two basic options. The first one is barbaric. The second one is more efficient and has the advantage of not being barbaric. So I think it's better. Milton Friedman once debated General Westmoreland, who was the head of the United States military forces in Vietnam. And Friedman shocked the general. He gave all the economic efficiency arguments for a volunteer army, and he said it's better more. And General Westmoreland said, you would have me commanding an army of mercenaries? And Friedman said, would you rather command an army of slaves? I think that was a pretty effective response. One last one?
So, Brazil has been relatively peaceful when it comes to war internationally, but our crime rate is pretty high domestically. And we often think that a stronger police will be a more efficient way to lower this crime rate. We often hold the case of New York, where they have a zero tolerance policy and they eradicate crime there. What are your views on that? Do you think a stronger police is a better way for
Everyone heard that? Maybe because of crime problems, you have more police, stronger police, tougher police, zero tolerance, crime will go down. Maybe. These are complicated matters, but here's one thing. New York got credit for lowering the crime rate because of this tough policy. But the crime rate fell in every American city. All of them, including ones that did not have New York's policy. So we should ask, what caused the fall in the crime rate? Given it also happened in every other city with the exception of Detroit, which is a catastrophe. Although even there it fell, just not as radically and dramatically. So it fell everywhere. There might be other reasons that explain that, and those are worth exploring. The idea that it was Mayor Giuliani and his police chief were the only reason, I just don't believe it. There's too much evidence on the other side. That said, there are some things you can do for better policing, and the broken windows theory seems to have been successful. Namely, if you tolerate broken windows in the neighborhood and smashing things, it will lead to more aggressive behavior. Stop that right now. Fix the window. So when I walk in the neighborhood, if I see it's a terrible neighborhood, I will change my behavior. If it looks like a nicer neighborhood, for most people, their behavior will become more respectful. That seems to have worked. Those policies, I think, are successful. But the use of overwhelming immediate police force, I do not think is successful. It's led to a horror in the United States of the rise of the SWAT teams, special weapons teams. These are militarized police, and we have them here in Brazil also. They engage in so much criminal behavior. They are so dangerous to the population. I think that they should be eliminated. And the number of SWAT teams in the U.S. grew from 200 to over 5,000 in a matter of about years. And I have a chapter in the book by Randy Valco on this. They commit so many crimes, and the things that they do are unconscionable, just unconscionable. And it was in the papers just yesterday, a tiny baby was severely burned, terribly, because these SWAT teams smashed in the door and tossed in a grenade, which landed in the baby's, whatever you call it, the little cage for babies. And it landed inside. And nothing's going to happen to these guys. And now it came out today in the papers, it was the same squad shot to death a pastor by bursting into his house. Oops, wrong house, and murdered him. Nothing happened to them. So I have very little sympathy for the view that you need tougher police. These people have more criminality. I think we need legalized narcotics. Half the problem goes away within 2 years. This is number two, and by the way, in 2 years half the problem will go away. The rest of it will diminish quickly after that. The second thing is move the police away from a military stance toward the population. They should be peace officers. And I would disarm them in most cases so they walk amongst the population and actually help people solve problems. The British police, for most of their history, had no firearms. And I really like that, having a police force that is not armed with heavy weaponry. And I would prefer to see a move in that direction. Certainly in the United States, and maybe think about it even in Brazil, that having military units is not the way to produce civil peace. Yes?
I mean, you're talking about a police force that is unarmed, that has no weapons at all. And how would that work? I mean, if I have a weapon and I'm a criminal, I just throw my weapon to the police officer and say, bow to me. Like,
I'm not saying that there should never be any police who have some weapons. But for a lot of policing, it's not needed. People patrol neighborhoods, for example. In many countries, the police do not carry firearms or any deadly weapon like that. Because their job is to police things, look out for things, make sure that there's not a house broken into, and so on. So in many countries, it works just fine. We have that. There are some circumstances where they may need firearms, but do recognize sometimes the introduction of an armed police escalates the other side also and leads them to be armed in order to deal with the police. So the question is, how can you diminish the total amount of violence in society? Number one, I mentioned, make narcotics legal. This is so well demonstrated. When the U.S. made alcohol illegal, the murder rate rose every year. It went higher, the rate of murder, until they legalized it, and it fell for 11 consecutive years. This is a pretty good graph to show people this and this. The war on drugs It starts and it just goes up, the violent crime rate. It's staggering. Get rid of that. The reason why the drug dealers carry weapons is partly to protect themselves from the police. If the police are not hassling them anymore, they'll be like alcohol dealers. And you don't normally see liquor store dealers coming in with firearms and grenades and rocket launchers, or bartenders and so on. They don't need it. So you can generally diminish that level of violence that's caused by bad policies. It's possible that there may be some residue that doesn't go away because of that, and then violence is needed. But if you don't have to use violence, you should avoid it. And I think there are many occasions when policing could be non-violent. And like I said, it's not a fantasy, it's not a silly utopian idea. There are lots of countries in the world where the police who patrol neighborhoods don't have any firearms. And those are very peaceful societies. Which is the cause of which? Right? They patrol peacefully because they're peaceful societies, yes. But one reason they're peaceful societies is their police do not brutalize people. So the question is, how do we approach this issue? And making the police less brutal may help to reduce the brutality in societies also. And I think that that's a better approach to policing versus the one that we've been seeing in recent years, which is more militarized police. They come in looking like space aliens, all this body armor, incredible weaponry, and they drive tanks. And I think we should move away from that model. That dehumanizes society. By the way, I should ask on time. I don't want to abuse. Sorry? We're okay? Yes, sir.
Okay. These whole country, all this liberty, we don't believe in liberty, right? All these things, how do you get rid of totalitarian government? I am originally from Venezuela, from a criminal government that just killed over 40 students. And I visited North Korea in October. And I was so surprised. I mean, this is a perfect totalitarian regime. At least for the time being. How do you get rid of these totalitarian regimes that are willing to kill their own people?
Well, a small point first. Venezuela is a increasingly criminal rule regime. I wouldn't call it totalitarian yet. North Korea certainly is totalitarian in the sense of a total state. Unfortunately, Venezuela, there is still civil society and opposition and so on. It gives us some hope. There's 2 points. One is foreign military interventionism rarely succeeds. So having the Yankees invade Venezuela and put in their favorite person, even you, I would not put great hope in that enterprise. It's unlikely to be successful. The movement for liberty is more successful when it comes from within and has support from abroad from other groups, but not foreign military intervention. People point to Italy, Japan, and Germany after World War II as counterexamples. Those countries aggressively waged war. They were defeated, their states were defeated, they're militarily occupied, and now they're basically very prosperous, wealthy, free societies, at least Japan and Germany. Italy is a more or less free, kind of wealthy, dysfunctional society. But better than it was. So those seem to be a big success stories. Even if you add Berlusconi in, it's at least still a success. But those are very different situations. There were states that waged war under totalitarian governments and were decisively, completely defeated. And everyone recognized they were defeated. This did not happen in Iraq. It would not happen in Venezuela. It would not happen in North Korea. So those examples are not good examples of total war leading to free societies, and not a very good model. Second thing, the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, ICNC. It's worth going to their website. They have stuff in English and Spanish and German and Portuguese and other languages. The studies that they have done show overwhelmingly that authoritarian or totalitarian regimes that are overthrown by force are less likely to turn into free societies than if they are overthrown through more peaceful means. Now, here's the key distinction. People think pacifism is the same as passivism. Does that make sense? To be a pacifist is to be for peace, you're against violence. People hear that, they think you're passive, inactive. That's not true. As people pointed out, Gene Sharp and others, there are forms of nonviolent conflict. You can engage in conflict with the rulers nonviolently. There are a lot of ways to do this. Venezuela, many of these are being used today. There are techniques for this. What consistently comes out is when a state is overthrown without thousands of deaths, there are always some deaths, but without mass death through war, the outcome is more likely to generate a peaceful, free society. If instead you just kill the rulers and execute all the leaders and all that, it seems, well, that's the way to do it. What happens? You set the precedent. Next time someone wants to change government, they kill the rulers and execute all the party members. And that's how it's going to happen the time after that, and the time after that. So peaceful, nonviolent change has many advantages. Number one, it's peaceful and nonviolent. Fewer people killed. That's a good thing. And number two, it's more likely to yield a stable, liberal democratic outcome. So I don't think that sending in the U.S. Marines or the 101st Airborne or some drones would make Venezuela a freer society. It's going to be hard work by Venezuelans. With the support of their friends in Brazil, Ecuador, the United States, Germany, and so on. But sending in the Mexican army or the U.S. Army is not going to make it free. So how do you deal with totalitarian regimes? Try to have peace between states, and then try to find other ways to undermine them. So North Korea, first, no military action is going to overthrow the North Korean state. They have nuclear weapons. That's a pretty powerful deterrent. Number two, even without nuclear weapons, they have over 40,000 artillery tubes trained on Seoul, South Korea. Within 48 hours, they can kill 1 million people. Just with normal bombs, they would totally destroy Seoul. And the leaders there are willing to play the game of chicken. You know that game? They see who will blame first. They say, if you were to attack us, we'd destroy you. Of course we'd lose, but you would lose millions of people also. Are you willing to do it? And the answer is no. I won't do it. We're very active with programs working with North Koreans, helping them to understand these ideas in the hope that there'll be a greater North Korea, a greater infiltration of these ideas into North Korea. I put a fair amount of money, not as much as I'm lying, into smuggling into North Korea. We smuggle the entire Wikipedia Korean on thumb drives, and the good news is the Chinese border is increasingly difficult to patrol by the North Koreans, and there are smugglers, and they bring in very inexpensive Chinese DVD players, because North Koreans find North Korea boring, as I'm sure you did. Just imagine if every television show, every day, was about two topics, one or three. Number one, Dilma. That's just all you see all the time. Dilma looks at a fish, Dilma puts on a shirt, Dilma's walking down the street, and so on. Just Dilma 24 hours a day. And then number two is tractor production is up. Kind of boring. Number three, I watched an entire program on how to kill rats on North Korean TV. It's kind of interesting. And they actually show people killing rats and how to do it, because rats are dangerous to socialism, right? The greatest threat to socialism because they eat all the food. So it's boring to live in North Korea. So they love seeing Korean hip-hop music and cool, fun stuff on these DVDs that they get very cheaply from China. And the DVDs have USB drives. So we just produced 60,000 USB drives with the entire Wikipedia in Korean. And we also put libertarian text in there. The works of Joe Costa, I mean, really important, cutting-edge stuff. And I hope that'll have an impact. But I think going to war will not. You just killed 5 million people. So that's the best answer I can give.
Right? Yes, ma'am.
So, how do you think the best way for people like civil society to react or say something against the assassination of social liberty and many types of liberties?
I'm sorry.
How do you think is the best way for civil society to react or say something against the assassination of liberty around the world? Not only like direct
Liberty.
Of liberty.
yes, not only like in a direct way, but indirectly too. As we all know, the United States was involved in many countries, and now recently, indirectly too, in Bahrain, where the Sunni minority oppressed the Shiite minority. And that's like, and of course, not only US is the bad boy, Brazil too, the political party of Dilma Rousseff, supports the dictator of Venezuela. How do you think we can react?
Those are good points. In the case of the United States in Bahrain, the U.S. has looked away. Some nasty things have been done because it's where the Fifth Fleet is based. That's why, right? So it's pretty obvious. The Iranians are very interested in Bahrain because that's where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is based, right? So having the U.S. Fifth Fleet on your country, turns out, can have a variety of risks for you. And it did suggest that the U.S. official policy of the U.S. government is rather hypocritical, pointing to human rights abuses there and not looking in a place where they have their own base. And that has been pointed out extensively, and it should be. This is a form of hypocrisy. I do think that civil society is very important in pointing out criminal behavior, and doing so in an intelligent way. The criticisms of U.S. drone strikes, to take an example, these are defended on the grounds that it's easy to do. You just have a little joystick in some place in California and blow up a person. But there's a lot of innocent victims nearby. It just happened to be in the house next door. They get blown up and killed. And no one wants to talk about them. The only people who have are voluntary civil society groups who raised this. And I think it has led to a pretty dramatic change in policy also. And the United States, the people who talk the most about this are the libertarians. And I'll tell you why. The president doing the killing is a left of center Democrat. So the left won't talk about it. And the right wing is embarrassed because they think it's cool. So the only people who criticize the president really are the libertarians. The only ones who are saying this is wrong. Why is this happening? To give you an example, the most horrible example, which I quote in the book, one of President Obama's biggest defenders defended the drone strikes. His comments were psychotic, really psychotic, or psychopathic. The one who doesn't care about other people. It's a psychopath. A critic said, I'm worried about this. I mean, you blow up and you kill a 4-year-old child? And he said, look, the question is, whose 4-year-old child is killed? Theirs or ours? God, how can anyone think like that? How can you think that way? And he was unashamed. He's also a very big Democrat figure in the United States. And he was
unapologetic for saying something so disgusting, so horrible. And libertarians raised this, and our friends in the US Congress were the only ones to raise this in the Congress. Justin Amash, who's a libertarian member of Congress, almost managed to defund the NSA. A really, really brave thing to do. So we need to be the ones who raise these embarrassing questions, and we do it because it's right, regardless of who's in power, left or right. It's because it's the right thing to do. So these organizations like Amnesty International and so on deserve the support of people who live in them. I'm very, very strongly in favor of that. I hope that's adequate. If you want a magic button how to solve all the problems, I don't have one. I wish I did. But what we can do is bring these issues to the consciousness of people and shame them. And that shaming actually has resulted in changes in policies in many countries. It's more powerful than people think. Rarely do the politicians say, I'm ashamed, so I'm changing my policies. But when you shame them, sometimes they do change their policies. We have seen that happen. Okay? Anything else? Juliana? Well, let me make one more comment though. And that is why I think liberalism not only is a philosophy of peace, it's an international philosophy. And this is something that why Students for Liberty is so important. For our friends on the left and the far right also, the collectivists, their number one virtue is solidarity with their own group, solidarity. As I mentioned, they create solidarity by having enemies. It's us, we're all together against that. But their number one virtue is solidarity. And the left uses this very intelligently. We stand with the workers of Mexico, and Brazil, and China, and so on. It gives a lot of moral power. For liberals, individuality is usually the number one. Be a person of integrity. Be the good person you should be. Is number one virtue. But it does not follow that solidarity is not a virtue. It is a virtue. It's not number one. But it's on the list. To say, I feel with other people when they suffer. Other people who are oppressed. My heart is with them. It's important for that to be part of the engine of liberty also. And the fact that we now have Students for Liberty all over Africa, all over Latin America, all over North America, all over Europe, increasingly in Asia, in Korea, in Japan, in South Asia, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Thailand, Australia, of all places. There's New Hampshire, the kangaroos out there, demanding liberty. That gives more power to our movement because we're the only ones who really believe in international peace. We are not protectionists, we are not mercantilists, we are not imperialists. We do not see your good as my bad. Economic nationalists are angry when other countries become wealthy. Mercantilists hate it when other people are prosperous. In the U.S., we have these economic nationalists. You see them on television all the time. And they're always angry at the Chinese and the Brazilians. Because look, they're becoming more prosperous. That means we're less prosperous. But that's not true. We should be happy when other people become more prosperous. It's good for us too, because if we trade with them, they can pay more for our stuff. It's also a sign of liberality. So this movement that you're involved in is really, above all, the global peace